Hello my gorgeous friends of Webflow, it's your friendly neighborhood Francesco from Supersado here. There's nothing better than soaking in a hot spring to come up with new ideas for your YouTube channel. Except that this time I actually made my mind up while having dinner in a tiny ramen place here in Tokyo. Quite the same thing anyway. This time we'll talk about native scroll triggered animation in Webflow. So, no custom code required. Here's what you will learn to create. 1. A center logo that gracefully moves up, shrinks, and lands in the navbar as you scroll. 2. A full screen element, like a 3D model from Spline, that scales down and glides into the navbar. 3. A text-based logo that reduces its font size and shifts into position as you scroll. 4. A bottom-line text logo that spans the viewport width and transforms into the navbar center. And the cherry on top? There's none because I add it all, but anyway, I'll walk you through how to create, use and animate variables in Webflow, making your animations feel even more dynamic and customizable. We'll use the iDesigner Lite free template from Rick Mamery, and you'll find the link in the description down below. So, if you're looking forward to it as I am, stick around, and if you're interested in learning more about Webflow or no-code tools, check out our courses on Superside Academy. Link is in the description down below. And if you find my video helpful and want to support my work, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. But now, if you're ready, let's dive in. Fundamental idea behind the animation we're going to build and the underneath structure of all the 4 scenarios we will analyze is that we want to scroll through an element, wrapping the hero section, and while doing that, we want the hero section to stick to the top, and in the meantime, the logo, the text, or the custom element inside the hero section should smoothly scale down, move up, and gently and perfectly position at the center of the navbar. But let's take a closer look at the structure of the page. In this page, we have 3 main elements, but the last 2 sections are just to fill up space. Our main focus will be on this juicy hero section framed element. We can see that its height is set to 200 VH. What's its meaning? Who knows? Except that it has a specific purpose, but we'll get back to it later. For the time being, let's open it up to reveal its content. The first element we meet is the hero section. No super special thing to highlight. I mean, we of course wanted to beautifully take up all the available space inside the viewport, so we set its height to 100 VH, and we already said we wanted to firmly stick at the top of the viewport while scrolling. After expanding the hero section, we come across the hero background wrapper, which is just an absolutely positioned div block used to wrap the image we want to use as a background for the hero section. And the image is just a wonderful picture of Mount Fuji with the width and the height set to 100% to make sure it covers the entire viewport. And the fit property set to cover, so it always keeps its original aspect ratio. We set the opacity to 30% for a nice effect. Then we have the big logo wrapper, and this is where things start getting interesting. Its display property is set to flex and the align property to center to make sure our logo, in this case, is always perfectly centered inside its parent. Its height is set to 100 VH to make sure it spans the entire viewport, and we are using relative position so that it can sit on top of the background image wrapper. Inside the big logo wrapper element, we have our logo. In order to let it scale nicely according to the device that's being used to navigate the website, I think the best approach is to set its height using VH unit. And now, the other fundamental piece on our chessboard, the navbar. Its display property is set to flex, so that we can push the logo and the links aside. Then we can see that the horizontal padding is linked to a variable, but we will see why later on. For the time being, let's just focus on 2 things. Its position is set to absolute, so that we can push it against the top of the hero section and avoid it taking up space within the section itself. Also, its height has been set using VH_unit. Why is that? In Webflow, when animating the size of an element, we can't use different units for the initial and final actions of the animation. So, because we set the height of the logo in the middle of the page using VH_unit to make it scale nicely with the height of the viewport, and we did the same with the height of its parent, the big logo wrapper, we will animate the height of these elements by using that same unit. As a consequence, using VH_unit to set the height of the navbar will make our life easy when it comes to make the logo land perfectly in the middle of the navbar, no matter the screen size of the device we are using. Inside the navbar, we have the logo link and the nav menu, but we won't spend time on those since they don't play a significant role in this context. As a side note, we can notice the navbar has a simple and default fade-in animation that's triggered when it scrolls into view, but that was just to make the design slightly more dynamic. Now it's time to move straight into the heart of the matter, the core of this whole project. Let's analyze the animation that actually lets us move and scale our logo to gently position it in the middle of the navbar. So first, let's select the hero section frame once again and let's open the interaction panel. We can see that we have two different while scrolling in view animations applied. The first one is for desktop, tablet and landscape breakpoints, while the second one is for the portrait breakpoint. If we open it up, we have three things to focus upon. 1. The animation boundaries. 2. The actual animation. 3. The smoothing. The animation boundaries are very important for the whole setup to work properly. First, we want the animation to start when the element is fully visible, so when the hero section frame is fully visible inside the viewport, which is exactly what happens when the page loads. Choosing starts entering would cause the animation to start somewhere in the middle of the timeline, because starts entering, as the name suggests, means that the animation is triggered as soon as the associated element enters the viewport. As for the end animation condition, we set it to is fully invisible and we applied an offset of 50%. Why an offset and why 50%? We'll get to it at the end of the video. Let's take it for granted at the moment. The smoothing is set to 60% just because we don't want to introduce too much delay between the scrolling action and the movement of the logo, thus making it easier to fine-tune the execution of the animation if needed. Finally, the actual animation, which is very simple actually. We have two actions at the very beginning and two at the very end. One to change the size of the big logo wrapper and one to change the size of the logo embed element. The initial values are the ones we set in the style panel. So 100 VH for the height of the big logo wrapper and 220 VH for the height of the logo embed. And we animate the height of the logo embed to 5 VH. The crucial thing is the final height of the big logo wrapper. In order for the logo to perfectly center within the navbar, it has to be equal to the height of the navbar, so 9 VH in this case. We can see that setting a different value would introduce an undesired vertical shift in the final position of the logo, which would break the layout. If we take a quick look at the mobile portrait version of the animation, the differences are only in the initial and final height of the logo embed element. These values have been introduced just to make things a bit more responsive. Let's activate preview mode to test the animation, and we can see that it's working pretty nicely, isn't it? There's also a fancier version of the animation, where we animate the height of the navbar from a larger value, 11 VH, to the one set within the style panel, 9 VH. And we apply an invert filter to the big logo wrapper to darken the logo, but that's not where I want our attention to focus on. The coolest thing about this animation is this percentage navbar padding variable. When adding an action to the animation timeline, we can choose to animate a variable. And if this variable is linked to an element's property within the style panel, that change will be reflected on that property as well. In this case, as the name suggests, we link this property to the padding of the navbar, and we are using this variable to increase the horizontal padding of the navbar while scrolling. How to add a variable to our project, link it to an element's property, and finally animate it. Let's first open the variables panel and access our variables collection. Let's get rid of the navbar padding variable for a moment, since we're going to recreate it. Let's click the new variable button and, in this case, click %. Let's give the variable a meaningful name and give it an initial value. Then select the navbar and, in the style panel, click to set the left padding. If we click on the purple dot, we can then pick a variable that will be linked to the left padding. Let's do the same with the right padding as well. Now, back to our animation. Click the plus icon to add a new variable action to the timeline and select navbar padding from the drop-down list. This action already comes with a default value, the one we set in the variables panel. Then let's duplicate this action and set its value. We can preview the animation and see that everything is working fine, but in case the padding of the navbar doesn't change, simply edit the default value of the first variable action to a different value. Webflow doesn't properly read it sometimes, and then reassign the original value. That should do the trick. Now, after diving really deep into the whole setup and seeing how it applies to our first example, let's move to the next one. This time, we will see how to animate a custom element, in this specific case a spline model, that takes up all the available space inside the viewport and make it scale down to perfectly fit in the middle of the navbar. The initial setup is practically identical to the previous one. We just have, instead of a logo, a spline scene whose height covers the entire viewport. We also set a 16:9 aspect ratio. The value will vary from spline scene, but I recommend to pick one anyway, so that the scene scales nicely during the animation. The animation setup is also the same as the previous example, so we will only focus on the actual animation to see that everything is almost the same. We're still animating the height of the big logo wrapper from 100 VH to 9 VH. The only difference is that this time we are animating a spline and we're simply changing its height from 100% to 90% of the parent container. Let's preview the animation and we can see that everything is working quite well, right? If you're wondering about the legs of our robot model, don't worry, the scene is not being cut. That it's just the way it was built from the very beginning. And that's it. We have a mobile portrait version as well, along with a slightly fancier version of the same animation, where we are once again animating the height of the navbar and its horizontal padding by using the variable we created. You can also see the effects of the invert filter applied to a spline scene. Before moving to the next example, I want to quickly show you that if we don't pick a specific aspect ratio for the spline scene and we set the width to 100% to make sure it's completely visible and spans the entire viewport, its size, well, it doesn't scale really nicely, right? But now, let's move on to example number 3, a text that's centered on the screen. This scenario is somewhat similar to the first one. We have a text centered on the screen, and we want it to scale down and have it nicely land in the middle of the navbar. This time though, we need to target the font size, and that's where things get interesting. But let's move forward step by step. Let's start by saying that the starting setup is exactly the same as the two previous examples, and that's one of the reasons why it's a very cool one. No matter what we want to animate, the starting point will always be the same. The only difference is in the element itself that gets animated. In this case, we have a text element and we can see that its font size is linked to the hero font size variable that we created by following the same steps highlighted in the previous example. The most important thing about this variable is that we're using VW unit, so that the text smoothly scales down along with the viewport width. Now, let's take a look at the animation. Once again, we animate the height of the big logo wrapper from 100 VH to 9 VH. But this time, instead of animating the height of the element inside the logo wrapper, we animate the variable that's linked to the font size of the text element. And here is where we can really appreciate the power of Webflow's variables that allow for even more animation flexibility by letting us animate properties like the font size. In this specific case, we go from 13 VW to 4 VW. Finally, let's preview the animation and watch it in all its beauty. And we have a slightly more complex animation this time as well, where we animate the height and the padding of the navbar. Now it's time for the last example of this journey in the world of Webflow's while scrolling animations, a bottom line text that spans the entire viewport. The general setup is, guess what, exactly the same as in the previous examples, except for a tiny little difference. The align property of the big logo wrapper is set to bottom, because it's where we want our text to be located at the very beginning. But this time, the text setup is slightly more complex. Let's start from the hero text wrapper element. This is not just div lock. We can see that its position is set to relative and that the bottom offset is linked to a variable. Why is that? And why something similar happens to the actual text element? I mean, after the previous example, we could expect the font size to be linked to a variable, but why its position is set to relative and the top offset is linked to another variable? To understand why, let's take a look at the animation, more specifically at the final steps. The first one is responsible for changing the font size of the text element. The second one changes the height of the big logo wrapper. And by taking a look at the blue boundary of the box representing the big logo wrapper element, we can clearly understand that the bottom alignment is what's causing the text element to not be centered inside the navbar. How can we fix its position? We have to find a way to superimpose the center of the text on the center of the navbar. In order to do that, we first move the hero text wrapper up by half the height of its parent, the big logo wrapper, to align the bottom of the hero text wrapper with the center of the navbar. And then we move the hero text down by half its height to finally align the center of the text with the center of the navbar. The value is 2 VW because the final font size is 4 VW and its line height is 1. So the height of the text element is 4 times 1 VW equals 4 VW. As usual, we also have a slightly more complex version of the animation. But now, let's go to preview mode to see this beautiful animation in action. Now, before we wrap up, as I promised a while ago, let's talk a little bit about the reason why the hero section frame element has a height of 200 VH and why we set an offset of 50% to the is fully invisible option. Let's start by saying that we can think of the height of the hero section frame as the speed of the animation. The taller the section, the slower the animation. There's not a one-fits-all rule. We can simply pick a value that looks good in that specific situation. Now, let's move to the is fully invisible offset. To understand its meaning, we have to ask ourselves when we want the animation to end. The answer is, we want the animation to end when the bottom of the hero section frame element is aligned with the bottom of the viewport. So, we want the animation to end before the hero section frame completely moves out of view. More specifically, we want the animation to end when the last 100 VH portion of the hero section frame is entirely within the viewport. What's the ratio between this value, 100 VH, and the entire height of the hero section frame element? It's 100 VH divided by 200 VH equals 0.5 or 50%. This is how we compute the value for the offset. Interesting, right? This setup is actually way too perfect, as we can see by quickly preview the animation. I mean, the animation ends just before the next section starts entering the viewport. If we want the animation to end slightly before that point, we have two options. Increase the offset a little bit, so let's say apply an offset of around 55% or less. Or two, in the animation timeline, we can move all the last actions from 100% to somewhere around 90–95%. And now that you learned quite a lot about Webflows while scrolling interactions, I think it's finally time to wrap this video up and summarize all that we have learned. And that's a wrap, my friends. Today we explored how to create stunning scroll-triggered animation in Webflow without writing a single line of code. From centering logos that gracefully scale and land into the navbar, to animating custom elements, text logos, and full-width bottom-aligned text. There's so much you can do to make your website feel alive and dynamic. We also unlocked the magic of Webflow variables, using them to make animations even more customizable and flexible. Now it's your turn. Get creative, try these techniques in your own projects, and don't forget to share your results. I'd love to see what you come up with. Of course, a link to the clonable for this project is available in the description down below. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more Webflow tips and tricks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Matane!